So in this video, let's learn about a modern JavaScript feature called promises. So let's now replace the old XML HTTP request function with the modern way of making AJAX calls, and that is by using the fetch API. So this is how we used to do it, and now all we need to do is to call fetch and then with our URL, and that's actually it. All we need to do now is to store the result into a variable, and let's still call it the request here. And now there are actually some more options that we can specify here and the fetch function, so if we like. But to make a simple get request like this one, all we really need is to pass in the URL, and that's it. So for more complex AJAX call, the fetch function can take it like an object of the options as well. But again, for now we don't need that, so we should also log the request to the console to see what's happens. And now let's give it a save. So you see here that the fetch function immediately return a promise here. So as soon as we started to request, we store the result of that into the request variable. And then as we log it, we immediately got the promise here. And here it says pending. So if we open that up, then here it says fulfilled, and we also have a result here, but I'm not going to go into full detail just yet. So one matter here is that now we actually have a promise, and so this promise right now in the store, and this is a request variable. But now what exactly is a promise and what can we do with it? Well, let's find out. So the formal definition of the promise is that it's an object that is used basically as a placeholder for the future result of the asynchronous operation. We can also say that a promise is like a container for asynchronously delivered value, or even less formal. So let's say that a promise is a container for a future value. That's the most straight-down definition of what a promise is. So a container or a placeholder for a future value. And the perfect example of a future value is the response coming from an AJAX call. So when we start the AJAX call, there's no value yet, but we know that there will be some value in the future, and so we can use a promise to handle this future value. And this will really make sense when we go back to code. But to understand this concept even better, I like to use the analogy of a lottery ticket. So a promise is just like a lottery ticket. So when I buy a lottery ticket, essentially I buy the promise that I will receive some amount of money in the future if I guess the correct outcome. So I buy the ticket now with the prospect of winning money in the future, and the lottery draw, which determines if I get the money or not, happens asynchronously. So of course I don't have to drop everything and keep waiting until the lottery draw happens. Now in case I did get the correct outcome, then I will receive my money because I have my lottery ticket, which is the promise that I bought. What's the big advantage of using promises? Well, there are two of them actually. First, by using promises, we no longer need to rely on the events and callback functions to handle asynchronous results and events. And the callback function can sometimes cause unpredictable results. So this is a big win already. But even better with the promises, we can change the promises for a sequence or asynchronous operation instead of a nested like we did in the last video. We can finally escape callback here, which was our initial goal all along. And by the way, promises are an ES6 feature, so they became available in JavaScript in 2015, and so by now they are widely used by everyone. Now, since promises work with asynchronous operations, they are time sensitive, so they change over time, and so promises can be in different states, and this is what they call the cycle of a promise. So in the very beginning, they say that a promise is pending, and so this is before any value resulting from the asynchronous task is available. Now, during this time, the asynchronous task is still doing its work in the background. Then when the task is finally finishes, we say that the promise is settled, and there are two different types of settled promises, and that's a fulfilled promises and rejected promises. So a fulfilled promises is promise that has successfully resulted in a value just as we expected. For example, when we use the promise to fetch the data from an API, a fulfilled promise successfully gets that data and it's now available to be used. On the other hand, a rejected promise means that there has been an error during the asynchronous task. In the example of fetching data from an API, an error would be, for example, when the user is offline, can't connect to the API server. Now go back to the analogy of our lottery ticket. The lottery draw is basically the asynchronous task which determines the result. Then once the result is available, the ticket will be settled. Then if we guess the correct outcome, the lottery ticket will be fulfilled and we get our money. However, if we guessed wrong, then the ticket basically gets the rejected, and all we did was waste our money. Now these different states are very important to understand because when we use promise promises in our code, we will be able to handle these different states in order to do something as a result of either a successful promise or a rejected one. Another important thing about promise is that a promise is only set as once, and so from there the state will remain unchanged forever. So the promise was either fulfilled or rejected, but it's impossible to change that state. Now these different states that I show here is relevant and useful when we use a promise to get a result, which is called to consume a promise. So we consume a promise when we already have a promise. For example, the promise that was returned from the fetch function. But in order for a promise to exist in the first place, it must first be built. So it must be created. In the case of the fetch API, it's the fetch function that builds the promise and returns it for us to consume. So in this case, we don't have to build the promise ourselves in order to consume it. Now, most of the time, we will actually just consume promises, which is also the easier and more useful part. And so that's what we do. But sometimes we also need to build a promise and to not just consume it. And of course, we will also learn how to do that a bit later. And so now let's actually start using promises in the next video.